So I'm going to ask people to mute themselves, please. And very pleased to be able to introduce once again my colleague and friend and president of PAR, Rabbi Harry Rosenfeld, for his second lecture.
Hey, y'all. Let's see here. Let's just go straight to this. I'm actually back home. It works so much better from here, as opposed to in a hotel room on a beach in Florida. Although being in a hotel room on a beach in Florida isn't so bad, let me tell you. But and next week I'll be in Antarctica. So I'm glad we got this in. Anyhow, tonight is Crucial Events in Jewish History, or How Judaism Became What It Is Today. And I hope that was the topic you advertised. If y'all were expecting something else,
no, it was.
In 1972, I was a camper at Klitz Camp, what used to be the Reform Movement's young leadership camp. And I took a class with Rabbi Joe Goldman of blessed memory, who on Jewish history. And this was not the title of the class. I forget where I got I forget where I learned this particular piece, but Rabbi Goldman really sparked my interest in Jewish history, which then I expanded when I was at HUC in Cincinnati with Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, also of blessed memory. And there have been very few moments in Jewish history which have, as Ellis Rifkin used to say, quantumly changed Judaism. Now, quantum change means it's something totally different than it had ever been before. And that's really, there are really only two periods in Jewish history that have done that. Now, that's a verifiable Jewish history, not talking about going back to Sinai and Moses and all of those kinds of things, but of history where we can verify it from outside sources. And they are a millennium plus apart, actually close to 2 millennium apart. But I added a third, because I live in New Mexico and I have to honor that New Mexican tradition. And so we'll see that as well. I'm really going to focus on the second one, not the one I added, but I'm going to focus on the one that's closest to our time, but I'm going to go back and just briefly cover the other two. Let's try that again. The first began, I should say, with the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, the first temple, and the exiles of the 10 northern tribes to everywhere from China to Africa to wherever, and the destruction of the first temple and the exile to Babylonia. The destruction of the Northern Kingdom was 570 BCE. Obviously, the first temple, as most people know, was destroyed in 586 BCE. And it's through those exiles and the destruction of the first temple that Judaism began to move away from sacrifice as its primary mode of worship and into a system that looked kind of like what we have today, where there were the equivalent, they weren't called synagogues, but the equivalent of synagogues in small towns, certainly in Babylonia, and certainly wherever the Northern Kingdom got exiled to, at least for a while, they also had their synagogues as well. The Jews of Mumbai trace their heritage back to the Northern Kingdom, as do several places in Africa, and certainly the original Chinese Jewish communities did as well. Again, the destruction of the second temple, which was the last destruction, I hope, because really, as one conservative colleague of ours once said to me, I really don't want to have to go back to sacrificing and taking my cute little yearling lamb that I love so much and have raised since it was weaned, to go slit its throat and throw it on a fire pit. I feel very similar that we should never go back to sacrifice, as did Maimonides. But it solidified our reliance on learning and communal worship. Now, obviously, the temple was communal worship, but this is a verbal worship. It's a whole different thing. It is quantumly different than what anything Judaism had done before, and it really did change the face of Judaism. And without it, without that change, we would not be where we are today. And I don't think we could have survived through the millennia, all the various things that we've had to survive. Now, the fate of the Northern Kingdom in exile, we don't know a lot about. In recent times, we have more and more communities claiming to be from there, from that exile. And those communities at most seem to have, as a biblical text, Genesis through Joshua. But the Southern Kingdom, the exile to Babylonia, really did shape the rest of worldwide Jewry. Now, contrary to what many people think, by the way, European Jewry, Ashkenazi European Jewry, I should say, came from Babylonia. They were Babylonian Jews who moved northeast. The Roman exile in 70, those folks became part of that Mediterranean Jewish community, which we erroneously call Sephardic, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Now, for the best description of what life was like for Jews, particularly in terms of creating this transition, that I have ever read, comes from the worst book that Anne Rice ever wrote, called Servant of the Bones. And she wrote it it was published in 2010. And it's the story of about some Babylonian exiles, one in particular, who becomes, as only Anne Rice could, although she did it poorly, becomes a spirit and is in charge of this set of bones. Now, that's the lousy part of the book. Unfortunately, you have to read through the first 3 or 4 chapters when he's reminiscing about what life was like before he became this spirit. He was a scribe. He was an exile from Jerusalem, from the Southern Kingdom. And the way that Anne Rice writes about that period of time and how those people, you know how those people is usually a negative? In this case, it's a positive. How those people, those scribes, and that literate elite transformed and saved Judaism and created synagogues and did all those kinds of things. She writes about it brilliantly. I highly recommend not buying the book, but seeing if you could find it in a library or in a book giveaway somewhere. But that description's really great. I just loved it. Unfortunately, I did read the whole book. And yeah. All right. Now, this golden age of Spain and the Inquisition and the Expulsion is what I added because I live in New Mexico. It is not, in most ways, it is not a transformative thing for all of Judaism and how we practice Judaism, but it was huge. And one of the reasons was the golden age of Spain was, until probably the 19th century, maybe the 18th century, was the most prolific non-legal Jewish literature, production of Jewish literature in our history. From the poetry to everything, whether it was Jews who were living under Moorish Spain, under Muslim Spain, or under Christian Spain, the the philosophy and the poetry and everything that came out of that was just so beautiful. But mostly we just talk about the expulsion, and that's what I want to do today. But in order to understand the expulsion, you have to understand that that golden age, that 500 years plus or minus before 1492, before the late 1400s, really was an incredible time. There were times of hardship when the Berbers came in to Spain, into Muslim Spain, and that's when Maimonides and others had to flee. But for the most part, until the Christian conquest of the Iberian Peninsula was complete, our life in Spain was actually pretty good. How good was it? Well, this is a picture of Maimonides, not the guy in orange, that's me, but the statue is of Maimonides. I took this in Gerona. This picture was taken in Gerona, I should say, and there's a statue of Maimonides there. And throughout Spain, if you tour Spain, in the old Jewish quarters, you will see this symbol in the sidewalk. It says Sfarad, stylized, and it's in the shape of the Iberian Peninsula, with the slightly misshapen Dalet here being Portugal, and this being Spain. They really are working on reclaiming the Jewish pieces of it. But in 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella finished their conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, expelling the last of the Muslims, and established their capital in Granada, here in this picture over here in the Alhambra. And this was their castle, which eventually becomes a Muslim fortress, or what was originally a Muslim fortress. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. And this was their home. And this is an actual picture of the second page of the expulsion decree. And the reason I picked the second page is because you can see up here, you may not be able to read it, but you can see it here are the signatures of Ferdinand and Isabella, and the official royal seal, etc. It was a horrific time for Jews. We had to make very difficult choices. The vast majority of Jews left Spain and eventually Portugal. The question is, where did they go? And this is what changed Judaism, what we now call Sephardic Judaism, but really Mediterranean Judaism, irreparably, and caused major upheaval in these Jewish communities. You can see that we migrated in those late 1400s, and then afterwards as well. We migrated to Portugal, to which we were expelled later, but it was later. Some went north, particularly to Amsterdam and Rottenburg, which becomes our heritage as American Jews, because those were the Jews who sponsored. Sorry, dog wants to go out. Cat's the other downside of being home. Come on, out here. My wife will be on her break in a few minutes and can take the dog. Anyhow, so the Jews who went to Amsterdam were founders of the Dutch West Indies Company. They're the ones who forced Peter Stuyvesant to let the Jews stay in New York. So it's important for American Jewish history. Some went directly to the Americas, originally to Mexico, and then north and south from there, north into the Americas, here in New Mexico. But it's here where the Sephardic Jews who migrated changed the Jewish world. If you're ever in Jerusalem and you're there on Shabbat, I highly recommend going to the Italian Synagogue. Not just because of the music, but because you will see and hear liturgy and rituals that are very different than the ones we're used to, and they're very different than any Sephardic rituals you would see anywhere. But the reality is the Spanish Jews came into all of these places, from Italy to Greece and Macedonia, up here into what today is Yugoslavia and Budapest, and certainly into Turkey and through the North African and Western Mediterranean coasts, and supplanted, in many of these cases, supplanted the local Mediterranean communities, each of which had their own customs and traditions. And now the dog wants to come back in. I like him much better during the day when he sleeps all day. Anyhow, so they changed everything. So for example, if you look at Salonica here, the Salonica Jewish community was very strong. It was very powerful, had incredible rituals and liturgies, music and culture, which when the Spanish Jews came in, they began to supplant. And hints of that Salonica ritual and tradition still exists today. But it was a quantum change for this region of Judaism. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about that, because it really didn't affect Judaism as a whole. Really the only other one, other than the destruction of the temples and our going into exile and creating synagogues and a value of literacy, did not happen until 1806 or 7. We call it the Napoleonic Sanhedrin. And it really is because of Napoleon that this quantum change occurs. So a little background. Napoleon was after the French Revolution, right? Liberté, fraternité, égalité, whatever the actual order is. That's why I said, you'd feel free to correct my French. So when he took over, those were the values that were already there in France, even though he gets elected emperor and all that kind of stuff. But in 1801, he creates what's called the Concord Dot. And his motivation for creating this Concord Dot, this new body of laws and philosophy about law, was really to try and bring the Catholics back into France, because France had become more of a Huguenot Protestant ethic, but there were still tons of Catholics, obviously, in France. And so this was his way of trying to bring some sort of healing to that schism, because he needed the support of everybody for what were going to be his campaigns. As a side effect of that, because Napoleon really didn't care about the Jews except for in two places, actually one place, they granted freedom of religion to everybody, as long as you recognize that the state came before religion. So if French law and religious law were in conflict, French law took precedence. Okay. And everything was great and hunky-dory until about 1805-6, at which point the Huguenots, the French Protestants, and primarily centered around Alsace-Lorraine and that area of France, began an anti-Jewish campaign, which, by the way, becomes the region where Jews took shelter during World War II. And it was those French Huguenot communities, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, which refused to turn the Jews over to the Nazis and hid them. Le Chambon, of course, is the most famous example, but there were others as well. But back in the early 1800s, those Protestant, the French and those Protestant French, the Huguenots, went to Napoleon and said, "We're suffering, and we're suffering because of the Jews." Now, how could they be suffering because of the Jews? Well, it's because the Jews were lending them money, and they weren't able always to pay them back because of a bad crop or, bad cattle conditions, whatever the reasons were. They just simply didn't have the money. And those silly Jews expected to be able to collect. And so they went to Napoleon and said, they're not really French. They're really an entirely different species, if you would. And speaking of Hartman, if you listen to today's Hartman lecture, if you happen to have heard it, she spends a lot of time talking about Judaism, how even in America, Judaism was considered a race into the early 1900s. And the American immigration laws separated out in the teens, separated out Hebrews from the places they were coming from. Okay, so but so these Huguenots were like, get rid of the Jews, or at least force them to stop, to forgive all our debts, or at least put the restrictions back on them that they had before the revolution and before the Concord Dot. Napoleon, however, really couldn't do that. And the reason was the same reason the Huguenots didn't want the Jews. Napoleon needed the Jews. He needed the Jewish bankers, the Rothschilds and the Hirsches and others, to finance his campaigns, to finance his military campaigns and the state. And so he was caught betwixt and between. And so with his advisors, and nobody's quite sure exactly who came up with the idea, they came up with this concept of what we now call the Napoleonic Sanhedrin, but was originally the Assembly of Israelitish Deputies of France and Italy, because he controlled part of Italy at that point. And we're going to look at some of the original documents of that, particularly the questions that Napoleon posed to the Jewish community, and they're brilliant. They're brilliant in the way they are phrased, because they tell you what answer Napoleon is looking for. And the answers the Jews came up with are honor that the best of our Talmudic traditions of being able to flip through hoops and say what we need to say, but in ways that, but they say it in a way that would not alienate Napoleon, because the French Jews felt French, and they wanted to remain citizens of France. Now, how is this a major change in Judaism? Well, we'll see that as we go along. So I want to go through the questions first. These are from the original source texts. You can actually still buy them on Amazon, evidently. I just did a quick search and found this edition. But these were originally collected by Diogenes Mama, who was a contemporary, who was alive at the time, and translated by an F.D. Kirwan, who I really couldn't find out anything about, in London in 1807. Now, before we continue, a trigger warning, I guess would be the right phrase. I didn't change the language. So this language that you're going to be seeing on the screen is Kirwan's 1807 translation. And I did that on purpose because I wanted you to have a feel for really what it was, how it was conveyed at the time. So I didn't change any of the God language. Everything's masculine, all those kinds of things. But I felt that in order to maintain, to get to the point I want to make, it was necessary to keep those things the way they are. Okay, so let's look at the questions. And as we look at each question, If you have something to write with, or you just want to make mental notes, whatever works best for you, or if you want to put it in the chat for that matter, what do you think, one, what do you think Napoleon was asking? And two, what do you think the answer he was looking for is? And if you were sitting in the Sanhedrin, what would your answer be? Okay. So we're going to look at the questions, and we will look at the answers also, I promise. But let's look at the questions first. The first question was, is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? Right? And this was a charge the Huguenots also made against the Jews. And it, it's true, biblically, even in the Talmudic period and even in the post-Talmudic period, more than welcome to have more than one wife. We'll see from the answer how they did that, how they came up with the answer. But, I think it's pretty clear here what Napoleon was asking for, what answer he expected, and how are the Jews going to get there. The second question, and this is an important question, not because of the specific topic, but rather because the way it's the question through which he tries, they tried to figure out what the Jews' relationship to France was. And they wanted to do it with some kind of thing from within Jewish law. So is divorce allowed by Judaism? That's an easy question. But here's the second part. Is divorce valid, although not pronounced by courts of justice and by virtues of law in contradiction with the French code? So if a Beit Din, if a rabbinic court grants a divorce, is it valid in the eyes of the Jewish community if it had not been first approved by the French courts and French law concerning divorce? Which is pretty amazing that the French law had divorce, given its Catholic heritage and the time period we're talking about, but it did. Okay. Continuing now with marriage, right? Multiple wives, divorce. Then they come back to, can Jews marry Christians and Christians marry Jews? Okay. Or are we only allowed to intermarry amongst ourselves? Now, I don't know about you, but I've been living this conversation my entire rabbinate, probably my entire life. I grew up at home in a congregation in Cleveland, Ohio, that had the most traditional services of any Reformed congregation in Cleveland at the time. And a rabbi who in practice bordered on Orthodox, but was the only rabbi in Cleveland and probably most of Ohio that would do an interfaith wedding. And that contradiction, or that reality, is what I grew up with. And when I say it was the most traditional Reformed congregation and Reformed rabbi, trust me, we were still Reformed. It was still mostly English. It was, but, you didn't get kicked out if you were wearing a kippah or a talit. Yeah, Suzanne?
No, there's just some noise in the background. I don't know if that's your dog.
That's the dog chewing on a bone. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I just thought,
give the dog a bone.
I don't mean to disturb the poor dog.
Oh, believe me, I wish you would. In fact, I'm shipping him to you tomorrow. That's my salary for this, is you have to take my dog. But here, is interfaith marriage prohibited by Judaism? Now, think about that. Think about what you know about Judaism, Jewish law, Jewish practice, going all the way back to the biblical period. Is interfaith marriage prohibited? We will see what their answer is. Now, here we begin to broaden the conversation. In the eyes of the Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brethren or strangers? Right? What comes first? Are we French first? Are we Jews first? Remember those conversations of 30, 40, 50 years ago? Are we American Jews or Jewish Americans? Really, one more conversation like that in youth group, and I would have converted to something else. I was so sick of them by then. But that's it. This is not a new conversation. It goes back to everywhere where we were granted some level of freedom. In either case, how are we supposed to treat French people? Right? What does Jewish law say how we're supposed to comport ourselves with non-Jews? And following along that, how French are we? If you say you're French and you treat the French people just like you would treat anybody else, non-Jewish French, we're citizens, the Jews were citizens of France. Do they acknowledge France as their country? Or is there this, and remember, it wasn't a reality for them, this return to Zion, that ultimately we're Israelite, we're Judean, right? Are we a people bound to a different land or a different society even? Right? Are we bound to defend France and obey French law? This is always my favorite of the questions. Who names the rabbis? My parents named me. I don't know about any other rabbi. But who, and this isn't who ordains rabbis. This is who picks the rabbi for each community. Right? Who hires the rabbis? What kind of police jurisdiction do rabbis have among Jews, and what judicial power do they exercise among them? I know I can tell you the answer today is we have no power. Certainly not in the outside the ultra-Orthodox communities. But in France, that was an important question. Because remember, this is 1806. There's only one kind of Judaism, which we now call Orthodox, but back then it was just Judaism. And rabbis did have authority. And we talked a little bit about that last time with the Maharal of Prague. And how are the forms of the elections of the rabbis and their police jurisdiction relegated by the law, meaning Jewish law, or are they only custom? And I love this question because what it doesn't take into account is that most often custom trumps, I guess I'm not allowed to say that anymore, supplants, overrides Jewish law or any law, any country's laws. Custom takes precedence over law, always. It may still be illegal, okay, but custom is stronger than law. You can pass a law that says anything. If it's not part of custom, it will take generations for it to be effective, if ever. Are there professions that Jews can not practice? You might think about, having a pig farm as one, but are there professions that Jews are excluded from? And then we come to the big two questions about this. These are questions 11 and 12, which everything else is based on. Does Jewish law forbid Jews from taking usury, and that's the important word, from their brethren, from other Jews? Now, what is usury? Usury is excessive interest. So when I was an assistant rabbi in Memphis in the early 80s, when you think inflation is bad today, those little kids, they don't know nothing from inflation. My savings account was earning 13% interest, right? That, forget anything else. That's inflation. And if you had a credit card from Tennessee, the interest rate was 30, 40%. Arkansas, right across the Mississippi, just across the bridge, had very strict usury laws and interest rates on credit cards in 1981, 82, 83 was limited to 5%. People today would kill for for a credit card rate of 5%. Trust me, they've changed the law since then. But usury is excessive interest, not charging interest, but excessive interest. And then, are we allowed to usury towards strangers, toward non-Jews? Whenever it says strangers here, it really means non-Jews. So I'm going to take a step back here. Tell me what you think about these questions. Nobody thinks anything about these questions.
Do you want to stop sharing for a second, and maybe if
Oh,
we
sure.
show,
Maybe that would help.
maybe if we show everybody's face. Let's see, who would like to answer that question? Christine, yes, you can always count on Christine.
I don't know whether that's good or not.
It's good.
Well, the constant struggle in France is always over what is really French. You know, who's really French? And this is, you know, it underlies all of the anti-Semitism in France to this day, as well as the right-wing, you know, fascist movements and neo-Nazi movements, because it's ethno-nationalism. And it tries to make, it racializes the French, which is very curious. And so Napoleon, on the one hand, is trying to establish the priority of the state without explicitly crushing or doing a Spanish Inquisition, because that was Catholic and you didn't want to go that direction. But it does demand, really, that that everyone compartmentalize the kind of ethics, values, and practices that are specific to a community, apart from the law, which has private priority, the French law. And so, so that's what that's what the Jewish community is struggling with, right? Well, you know, if we fast forward to today in Israel, we know the difficulties that women trying to get a divorce encounter with places where you have religious jurisdiction, and so in some ways, having the French state have priority was, I don't want to stress this too much because it was really anti-Semitic, but it was liberating to an extent in that it gave people alternatives to some of the more oppressive aspects of the religious courts. So, but that's the struggle. The struggle is like, where do you put something which had a kind of state power at one point before the destruction of the temple to deal with modern states?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do it? And it's still a struggle, and it's still going on, and it still underwrites a lot of the ethno-nationalist struggles now. That's my view, anyway.
Anybody else?
Rabbi, I have a letter here written May 18th, 1818, during Napoleon time. This was on my father's side. Somebody knew, Dreyfus was the name.
Oh,
and they say it was
not the Dreyfus, but a Dreyfus.
Yeah. And they wanted to get married in the town in the Rhine region, the town named Hessler. And they he said the procureur impérial. Comment on dit ça, Rabbi?
General
Imperial.
Oh, let me look it up. Hang on. Just sorry, I am not going to
The
say
Commandant Impérial?
procureur,
Imperial.
prosecutor,
Oh,
prosecutor.
that's the prosecutor.
It's a prosecutor.
Yeah.
And who said qu'il y avait déjà trop de juifs à Hesloff,
There were too many Jews in
Jews
that
in
place.
Hesloff, et pas empêcher le mariage des sous-signés,
So they're trying to stop the marriage.
to stop the marriage.
Right. The Napoleonic Sanhedrin didn't fix everything. I mean, it didn't
Yeah.
change non-Jewish. It quantumly changed the Jewish community, however.
Mhm.
It didn't necessarily change the anti-Semitic nature of the people around them, but it did change us.
Mhm.
And again, without the Napoleonic Sanhedrin, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having these kinds of conversations. Okay.
You know, what you bring up, Suzanne, is really, really interesting because, I mean, for many reasons, but one of them is that it forefronts the way that the French state started obsessing about there not being enough real French people really early. You know, this is the depopulation of the countryside and and all these other things. But it shows how intensely anti-Semitic that became. It's very, very early. Very.
Well, later on with the Dreyfus case.
I know. Yeah, I wrote. That was my first
Yeah.
first paper in college. Was
But let me say, if it hadn't been for the French people, my family and I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the answers, because I do want to get through those. This is Wyatt, by the way. He's the one who was chewing on the bone earlier.
Hi.
Very nice.
Okay, so let's look at the answers. Can Jews have more than one wife? Oh, go ahead, Suzanne. I'm
No,
sorry.
there's a big black line, but it disappeared. So it's cool.
Yeah, that was just me. Is it lawful Jews to marry more than one wife? First of all, I don't know why anybody would want more than one spouse. I mean, it just makes no sense to my brain. I don't understand it. Those fundamental Mormon communities, I don't understand why. It just makes no sense to me. Right? No, it's not legal for Jews to have more than one wife in Europe. Right? If you came from the Muslim world, Jews in the Muslim world had more than one, not everybody, but often had more than one wife. It depended on financial status and all those kinds of things. But in the 11th century in Worms, we read about Rabbi Gershon, and we always put it on him alone. But their answer was there was a body of 100 rabbis, and they pronounced, I think that's supposed to be an anathema, not and anathema. I guess that would be mine. And also the non-capitalized I is mine. Against every Israelite who should in the future take more than one wife, which is a very interesting statement. In the future, nobody was forced to divorce extra wives under this decree within the Jewish community. But you couldn't get any more. And it was only supposed to, remember I said custom is more important and takes precedence over law. This was in the 11th century, right? This law expired. It was a 1,000-year law. It expired in the 70s, in the 1970s, right? And you don't see people clamoring, right? Because after 1,000 years, this is the way it is now. But again, in the Muslim world, they're just talking about in France and Europe. Divorce. I love the language, by the way, that they used in these translations. I just love it. repudiation, they don't say divorce in their answer, they say repudiation is allowed by the law of Moses, but it is not valid if not previously pronounced by the French code. It's not valid unless, pronounced by their rabbi, it's only valid if it had previously been pronounced by a competent tribunal, French court. Okay. So French law takes precedence. Now, I'll come back to that. And here we see with mixed marriages, right? With mixed marriages, it's a brilliant answer. And it's absolutely correct. Now, again, these are just excerpts from the whole answer. I wasn't going to burden you all with that. If you really are interested, you can find the book yourself. There is nothing, and this is true, there is nothing in Jewish law that says Jewish men and women can't marry non-Jewish men and women. Nothing. Nothing. And if we look at our biblical tradition, we see that's certainly true. I mean, Solomon is an extreme case, but, you know, we've got lots of examples, Moses, Abraham, right? There's nothing in Jewish law that says we can't intermarry. However, the rabbis aren't going to do these weddings anymore. And then comes the beautiful, in my mind, the pièce de résistance to this is any more that a Catholic priest would do a mixed marriage between a Catholic and somebody not Catholic. Now, remember, today's very different. This is 1806, but look at the beauty. Look at the beauty, the intelligence behind this answer. They knew what answer Napoleon wanted, right? The answer has to be, yeah, mixed marriages are fine. But the Sanhedrin was composed of 2/3 rabbis, 1/3 lay people. And the rabbis were saying, we're not doing those weddings. And they're not Jewish weddings. We may not recognize them as religiously valid, but they're still married. We're not going to marry them to anybody else, right? But Catholics wouldn't do this either. And that is such, and they could have easily have said Protestant ministers, because Protestant ministers back then wouldn't have done that. They may have done them between different Protestant denominations, but it would be the exceptional Protestant minister that would marry a Protestant to a Catholic, let alone to a Jew, without conversion. This is all without conversion. Look at it's such a well-crafted answer, to give the answer that they knew they had to give, and at the same time maintain their integrity to their own practice, or what they hoped would be the practice. Are French considered brethren or strangers? Gee, I wonder what answer Napoleon wanted here. Right? This is one of the longest answers, because the simple answer is, yeah, of course, we're brethren, as it were, and not strangers. But then it goes through this long conversation of a few pages about how we're supposed to treat the stranger well and what our obligations to the strangers are. And it's not just about, the answer to this question is not just about this question, but it's anticipatory of the questions to follow. And the answers they knew they needed to give to those questions. What does our law say about how we're supposed to treat non-Jews? Right? We treat them the same as we treat each other. The only difference is we worship differently. Everyone in his own way. And again, I apologize for the masculine language. But everyone worships God in their own way. That's true within the Jewish community. That's true within the most orthodox of Jewish communities, right? Everyone has a different theology to some degree or another. We don't have this. You can read, I think, 2 Jews, 20 opinions. When it comes to theology, 2 Jews and 480 opinions. Because we're constantly growing and evolving in our theology as we grow and evolve as people. But no, there's no difference. You worship at Notre Dame. We worship at the Great Synagogue. Speaking of the Great Synagogue, I want to mention that right before when I come back from letting the dog out yet again. When we scheduled this class, my wife was not supposed to work Thursdays.
Hey, listen, I thought my dog and cat were annoying.
Yeah. They'll be back in a minute. Actually, I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to make a note to come back to that, the Great Synagogue. Okay. Because that is a piece of the story also. Are we French? For French citizens, are we really French, and do we obey the law, and do we go in the army? Well, as part of this answer, they cite, much as the Jews did in 1933 and 4, and up until the deportations really started, these Jews cited all the acts of heroism that Jews had done in previous wars on the side of France. Okay, of course we're French, and of course we're honor bound to defend the country. And then look at this last paragraph. Love of the country is in the heart of Jews, a sentiment so natural and so powerful and so consonant with their religious opinions that a French Jew considers himself in England as among strangers, although he may be among Jews. Now, that's powerful. It comes from an old rabbinic Talmudic tradition of Dina de Malchut de Dina. The law of the state is the law we follow. But the way it's expressed here, right? Now, you notice what country they picked. They didn't say Jews of France who are in Italy, Jews of France who are in Germany, Jews from France who are wherever, Jews of France who are in England, right? Because that was the great rival to Napoleon, right? And oftentimes we feel the same way, right? I go to synagogues wherever I travel. I don't think I'll be going to one in Antarctica, but most places I do. And the customs, traditions are different. I don't know any of the people. Some of the services I like, some of them I don't. That doesn't mean they're not good services, just my personal preference. And, but at the same time, I still feel connected to these people as Jews. They're saying, no, we don't. That France takes precedence because they weren't stupid. They knew what the answer had to be. Who names the rabbis? The flip-flopping in the answer to this question is just, to me, hysterical because there isn't a correct answer. And they were trying to come up with one. The bottom line being, every community picks their own rabbi. We were talking about the Maharal of Prague last time, the chief rabbi of Prague, who famous for the golem and all that stuff. It was his, oh God, I forget if he had been thrown out of 6 congregations or 16 congregations. I know there was a 6 in it before he got to Prague, right? Congregations pick their own rabbis. Communities pick their own rabbis. That's true to this day anywhere. What kind of, I just have to laugh when I read this. What kind of police jurisdiction do the rabbis have? I will not put Rabbi Singer in the position of answering that question. I will tell you I had none. right? And here, this one, oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. The qualification of rabbi is nowhere to be found in the law of Moses. Why? Because there weren't rabbis in the time of Moses. Right? And even in the Talmud, there are hints as to how one becomes a rabbi, gets to be ordained, but no set of laws. It's kind of like the conversion laws. You teach them a little bit and, tell them that they're great penalties if they violate the law, but you don't have to teach them all the laws. And then they're Jewish. Okay. The Beit Din, right? Since the revolution, rabbinic tribunals, a Beit Din, are totally suppressed in France and in Italy, right? We live by the laws of the state. A rabbinic court has no authority. Now, that's only partially true. I mean, if someone, I remember when I was a teenager in Israel, living in Israel for a semester, went to a moshav that was really a transplanted Polish village after the war. And this guy comes running into the Rebbe's. We're talking to the Rebbe, not understanding a word because it was all Yiddish, and neither of us, my friend and I, didn't understand Yiddish, but we had a translator. And this guy came running in and was totally upset. And the Rebbe, he had this whole conversation, and the Rebbe pulls a book off his shelf, which clearly he didn't need to do, but flipped some pages, gave the guy an answer. The guy went, "Oh, I'll do this." And it was all about whether or not his wife was baking a cake, and instead of breaking the eggs in a separate bowl like you're supposed to, she broke the 12th egg into the general mixture, and it had a blood spot. Does that make the whole thing treif? And the answer the Rebbe gave was, if she's already mixed it, it's fine. If she hasn't mixed it, it's not fine. It's treif, and she has to throw it out. 12 eggs is a lot, is pretty precious, even in a farming community. And so the guy goes, "All right, I'll go run home and tell her to mix it." And the Rebbe went, "No." And that was the law. Within the confines of Jewish law, kashrut, how services should be led. Yes, rabbis still, even in France, had that kind of power. Here they're talking about settling of disputes concerning money or torts or those kinds of things. And yes, there should be a space in ecclesiastical hierarchy. I can't tell you how many times I proved this. Right? Is this law or custom? Right? I love the beginning of this answer. The answer to the preceding question makes it useless to say much on this. Right? We already answered this question. Right? Even if they had preserved some jurisdiction, which is not the case, neither the jurisdiction nor the laws said to be sanctioned by Jewish law, they would only be custom. Only custom, which is true. Nope. We're required to teach our kids trades, and whatever that trade may be is just peachy keen. Right? You want to be a pig farmer, okay, goes into, hey, just don't eat them. Unless you're my wife or something, I don't know. Right? Usury. And this is what it all boiled down to. The answer to this that Napoleon wanted was clear, right? And here the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, the 2/3 that were rabbis, the 1/3 that weren't, right, make a distinction between interest and usury. And they do that on purpose, right? The Hebrew word in the second paragraph, the first paragraph says, no, we're not allowed to even charge interest to other Jews, right? That's the biblical law, absolutely. Then they start to get a little picky here. The Hebrew word nechech has been improperly translated as usury. In the Hebrew language, it means interest of any kind. And the underline was theirs, by the way, and not, there should be a net in there, and not usurious interest. Not, it was really, they mean not just usurious. It cannot be taken in acceptance now, given the word usury. But, and here's where they, again, come up with this beautiful answer. What was the aim of the lawgiver in forbidding one Hebrew to lend interest to another? It was to draw closer between them the bonds of fraternity. Right? Now we're going back to the language of the revolution, to give them a lesson of reciprocal benevolence and engage them to help and assist each other with disinterest. Yeah, that word, right? But there's more and this is the long answer. But we must not forget these laws, so humane and admirable in these early periods, were made for a people which then formed a state that had a rank. These were laws that only applied when we were an independent nation with our own land, self-governing. However, now that we're scattered everywhere, right, if we come down here, right, we no longer have to maintain among them the primeval equality of property. If you think about biblical law, right, in the Jubilee year, all the property had to go back to its original owners, supposedly. Okay? That's not the case here anymore. We don't own land. We don't own land in Israel that can go back. We don't know where the tribes were or anything like that, right? So there's no primeval equality of property. Although filled with the spirit of the legislation, we still are filled with that spirit of we shouldn't charge usury. They have been sensible that the letter of the law could no longer be obeyed when its principle was done away. And they have, therefore, without scruple, lent money on interest to trading Jews as well as to men of different persuasion. It becomes a business transaction. When it's a business transaction, interest is okay. Usury is not okay. But interest is okay. And that was the practice. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with how Jews got into the banking business. Anybody? Of course, Christine, yes?
They were forbidden to do other things. We'll start there. But also the crown, various places, needed money, and they couldn't rely on other lords and so on and so forth to pay them back, because they could like bankrupt the state and or take over the state. So they wanted a group that was outside of the coterie of people who would be successors that they could take money from, and then, if things got bad, they could say, we don't owe you anything, you're strangers, you shouldn't be doing this in the first place, and you have a convenient target for stiffing.
That's the practical.
Yeah, Trump could have taken notes on this one.
Right, that's the practical. They could always say, we don't owe you the money.
We don't owe you the money.
And we would have no power to say anything otherwise.
Yeah.
But that's not the only reason. The reason they pushed us into, and yes, we were forbidden from guilds and from all sorts of trades and everything else. But what today we call Catholics, or the Catholic Church, forbade lending money to other Catholics at interest. Christians were not, there weren't anything else other than Catholics in this part of Europe originally, right? Catholics weren't allowed to lend money to Catholics. Christians were not allowed to lend money at interest to Catholics. They followed the biblical law. So they had to go find somebody outside of the law in order to be pushed into banking. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is also very practical, right? And that's piracy. Right? To get money from Europe to North Africa or anywhere along the trade routes, right? If you were carrying the gold with you, you could be robbed, you could be whatever. But if your cousin Shloimi is at the other end of the trade route, You don't have to send all the gold with every caravan. You can send heavily, once in a while you send a heavily armed protected caravan with what you owe to cousin Shlomi at the other end of the world. So we had those familial relations across the entirety of Europe, North Africa, and into certainly into Western Asia, and throughout the Middle East as well. So we were pushed into these banking by circumstance, by Christian law, and also because, as you said, it's easy to just go, nah, don't owe you anything, go away. You want to argue about it, we'll kill you. It's very simple. It's also why when the Jews were expelled from Germany in the 11th century, right, they went east into Poland, or what today is Poland, and Russia, because they were invited in, because those governments wanted that ability to lend. Oh, see, it's not just my dog. Okay, who's now finally sleeping quietly. But what about towards strangers? Well, they already said that. We're not going to do that, right? Equally condemned by the law of Moses and Talmud, we're generally forbidden, but, right, when it comes to commerce, yes, we can, but not usury. Only reasonable interest. Okay, so how did those answers, how well did you do in figuring out what the answers would be? Right, it's not that hard. Those questions were phrased to elicit certain answers. The people of the Great Assembly were smart enough to figure out what the answers they should give are, and how to phrase them and comport them into a Jewish piece here. Okay. Why is this, however, the second quantum change in creating Judaism?
Oh, are you asking, or you?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to ask.
Well, it seems like this is transforming Judaism from an ethnicity to a religion.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Very true. But what else? Another piece of it. So let me tell you about the Great Synagogue in Paris. Okay. Now, for those of you who know anything about the early beginnings of Reform Judaism, know that one of the great contentions between those who wanted to make changes in Judaism in Germany and those who wanted to maintain what Judaism always was the use of instruments. Not just the use of instruments on Shabbat, but the use of instruments stam, period, right? Because you weren't, according to what becomes the Orthodox view in Germany, was that you can't have instruments at all. They were restricted to the temple in Jerusalem, and we can't have instruments in our places of worship until the temple is rebuilt. Right? Okay. However, the opening and closing ceremonies of this Great Assembly, and actually some of the sessions themselves, took place in the Great Synagogue of Paris. And in the opening and closing ceremonies, which were not on Shabbat, obviously, there was music. And not just any music. There was the music that created this, the final straw in the split between Reform Judaism in Germany and parts of Europe and the Reformed, what becomes the Reformed Jews. It was an organ. It was organ music. The Great Synagogue in Paris had an organ that was purported to be second only to the organ at Notre Dame. And it was used regularly for concerts, for special occasions, not on Shabbat or holidays, right? That was over the line, but they had this. And we find that in the 1830s, I believe, the Jews of Germany forced the synagogue in France, the great synagogue in France, to remove its organ. Okay. That's part of the key to what changed about Judaism. When Judaism becomes a religion, we can have lots of different kinds. And what these folks did was they said Jewish law is secondary. And we want to be a part of the society in which we live. And we demand it, as a matter of fact. And that means if we're going to do business with people who outside of our community, we can't keep kosher because business is done over meals, right? You can't just have people to your house all the time, right? You have to reciprocate, or you have to meet them at a cafe or whatever, right? We're going to start doing business on Shabbat because we're French. And religion is not a way of life. Religion is a belief system. Belief systems can change. The Sanhedrin, and it's important that it was in France. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Sanhedrin allowed the Jewish community in Europe to begin that, some would say, slippery slope. Others would say a needed transformation into a multi-dimensional religion with denominations. Okay. Say what you will about Hasidism versus the Mitnagdim, the anti-Hasids, right? They practiced the same way. You know, the Hasids had more music. They said, yeah, it's okay to be happy. Okay. Laws of kashrut were the same. How one worshipped it didn't change. I mean, the order of the prayers and everything else, right? They would never have thought of taking Messiah out of the liturgy. They never would have thought of taking resurrection out of the liturgy, right? Because those weren't just religious beliefs or philosophies. That was identity, right? That's survival. That was our identity. That was how we were going to be redeemed. With the Sanhedrin, it became for European Jews no longer necessary to have that. And lest you think it didn't impact Eastern Europe, yes, Napoleon, when he took these things everywhere he went, right? As he moved farther east through Europe, he brought these changes with him. When he got pushed out, there was backlash and whatnot. But prior to this, without this, you would not have ever seen in Poland, in Russia, in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, you never would have seen Bundists, Jewish Bundists. You never would have seen Jewish atheists. You never would have seen Jewish communists. You never would have seen, anything like that. You would not have seen Jews who wanted to be part of government in an actual official capacity. And why is it important that it came out of France? Because France isn't just an Ashkenazi country. It's a Mediterranean country. And the Judaism of southern France followed what we now call Sephardic custom and tradition. And yet these same values trickled their way down there and began to spread throughout the Jewish Mediterranean, and not just the northern Mediterranean. Yes, it was much less effective in the Muslim world, among the Jews who lived in the Muslim world, But there were little bits and pieces that began to creep in. And even in today, Jews who have left those parts of the world, mostly for Israel, but also other places, have also have been, I wanted to say infected, but that has a very negative connotation, which I don't mean, have been inculcated with this concept of Judaism as religion and not way of life. Now, I have my own definition of Judaism as a faith family, not unique to me. I learned it from others, but which combines religion and culture and way of life and all those kinds of things. But, we look at, when we argue things in America before the Supreme Court for Jewish practice, not have Christmas trees forced upon us or whatever, we do it under the freedom of religion clause, not out of the freedom of culture or identity clauses, which there aren't any, right? We take it under freedom of religion. When I testified year after year after year here and everywhere else I've lived, to maintain safe and legal access to abortion and other reproductive health things, right? The most persuasive argument I had was it was a violation of Jewish religious freedom, because Judaism teaches that sometimes abortions are mandatory, not even optional. Sometimes they're mandatory, sometimes they're forbidden, sometimes most of it's in the middle, but you're violating our people's right to exercise their religion in the way that we should be allowed to exercise it. All religion. Right? Without this change, and if it didn't happen here, it would have happened somewhere, right? But without this change, we would still be living in Jewish neighborhoods. We would have to. This is the only way we could really be, because access to kosher meat. We'll just start with that. Yes, the Orthodox Jews, the few Orthodox Jews who lived in Anchorage, shipped their kosher meat in from Seattle. You want to talk about expensive, right? That's expensive, right? Here in Albuquerque, they have to do the same thing. The nearest kosher butcher is Denver, I believe, right? Or Phoenix. There's equidistant from here. And so, no. We can live anywhere now, and we do, and not just because American law allows us now, but this changed how we live as Jews and what Judaism was. Rabbi Singer, I see your hand.
So I have a question, because Reform began in Germany a little bit after the Sanhedrin, and so I'm wondering, was it a parallel development, or was it a result of this, or was it in the air? Just wondering what the influence was.
Well, you have to remember that by 1810, which is sort of about when Reform Judaism started, Napoleon had swept through Germany. And he had brought this with him. And he had given Jews throughout, wherever he went, Jews were then allowed to be citizens, right? And once that change happened, and then you have, I kept wanting to say Moses Mendelssohn, that's not the case. No, it was Mendelssohn, sorry. Not Montefiore, it was Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn, who was an Orthodox, what we would call an Orthodox Jew, but he translates the Bible into German to bring it to more Jews. He does all these, things about integrating into general society. Well, he translated the Bible in 1790 something, I think. Maybe it was 1780 something. I'm pretty sure it was in the 1790s. And, it's the same time period. And he, Germany, France, it was that same back and forth kind of thing. It wouldn't have happened in Poland. It wouldn't have been translated into Polish first, right? It had to be close to this. And the Germanic states, the Northern Germanic states, we have to differentiate. The Northern Germanic states were more liberal what we would call liberal, politically, closer to what was going on in France after the revolution in terms of liberty and stuff. But yeah, it's nothing's a coincidence, right? Would it have happened anyhow? Yeah, I think it would have happened somewhere within 50 or 100 years, because you have the whole Enlightenment going on at the same time. And, not to mention Spinoza and Descartes really messing things up in Europe and for the Jews. And in terms of breaking down historic ideas of what it meant. I mean, yeah, so it would have happened anyhow, I think, but this is kind of the trigger. Now, you'll notice I didn't put in this because it doesn't equal in terms of the kind of quantum change. I didn't put the Shoah in, and I didn't put the state of Israel in. Now, the Shoah, as life-changing as it was, didn't change Judaism. Right? Judaism did not go through a quantum change because of the Holocaust. And the state of Israel is only 80 years old. And while it's still finding its way in terms of what it means to be Jewish in a Jewish land, the Judaism you see in Israel is not really different than the Judaism you saw without an Israel. Okay, especially in the post Napoleonic Sanhedrin time period and the post Enlightenment time period, where Jews were suddenly, non-religious, as it were. If you could be religious, you can be non-religious. And the majority of Israelis went, we live it, we're closed on Shabbat. That's good enough for us. And we're not going to work on Yom Kippur, and we're going to walk instead of drive our cars, but only on Yom Kippur. Right. Israel's still finding its footing when it comes to being what it means to be a Jewish state. Maybe one day we will see it. A quantum change in what Judaism is and what it means to be Jewish come out of Israel, but it's too soon, or it hasn't happened yet, I should say. I'm done.
Yeah. Now, do people have any questions or comments?
The chat's been very quiet.
Christine, go ahead.
I just want to thank you for making this happen, Rabbi Singer, and for leading us to a really interesting reevaluation of that Napoleonic Sanhedrin, which I knew about vaguely, right? But this really sharpens it and makes it really, really pertinent to some of today's issues, and just fantastic. Plus, brilliant responses to these leading questions.
Yeah, I'm not that creative. They were great.
That's really good.
How would you say Jews are doing in France today?
Oh, yeah.
It depends on what you mean by how they're doing. It's the largest group of Jews making Aliyah are coming from France, and the largest country that's losing Jews at the fastest rate is France, because of the amount of anti-Semitism and whatnot. It's attributable to lots of things, both politically and culturally. But at the same time, the French government, I think, just again reinforced its anti-headscarf law, which, by the way, impacts us, because it impacts whether or not you can wear a kippah in certain situations, which was an issue in this country until about 10 years ago. Yeshiva University wasn't allowed to play in certain tournaments because you weren't allowed to wear a hat or any kind of head covering. and with a kippa, it's going to fly off. I mean, they finally had to get them. They were finally allowed to wear them because of chin straps. But in France, yeah, I mean, I would not live in France today. I wouldn't live most places today, but I wouldn't recommend anybody move to France today. It's just, it's not just moving to the right. There's this, I don't know, kind of pendulum swinging back to the Dreyfus kind of stuff that was going on. But there's still some places in France that are still very protective of its Jews and of its other non-Christians as well. Just not really, just not so much in Paris, I guess.
So Harry, Richard Edelson is on the call, and it's nice to see you, Richard, although I don't see you, I just see your name, but he wrote in the chat, I haven't seen my learned schoolmate since 1981.
Oh my God.
Wonderful to hear him today, and I congratulate him on his distinguished rabbinate.
Hi.
So Richard sometimes joins us at high holidays, but it's good to see him here today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other comments or questions before we end? And there's another dog. See that? You're not the only one with a dog. Christine has a little cutie behind her. Yeah, there you are.
Did I tell you what my dog did during my goodbye service? Retirement service. I through the pandemic, I was doing services outside on Zoom. That was my backyard. Dog was back there, right? Never did anything, never bothered anybody. During my goodbye service, I have a dual level. My backyard has tiers, and he was on the upper tier, and right there, he decided, in the middle of that service, he decided it was time to go to the bathroom.
Oh, of course.
And it was like the only time. So I'll block him now because he's being inappropriate. But
there was a Zoom set. I think it was a guy doing the weather or reporting. Who knows what he was talking about? Because in the back on the mantle was his cat licking certain inappropriate areas, and nobody could pay any attention to what he was saying. Everybody focused on the cat. So this is the joys of Zoom.
Right. I would all just, I would say that we have we may be in another major transitionary period. And I think it was coming anyhow. That beep was my printer turning off, sorry. It was coming anyhow, but the pandemic speeded it up. And that's technology. I mean, we started off with looking at those TikToks from Miriam, whatever her last name is. And that's important. But think about how people are no longer restricted in where they attend services, right? It could be anywhere around the world, or where we get our learning resources from. I kept my old email address, and I still get emails for the new rabbi, for my successor. I got one today from a friend of hers in Israel, who offered her a series of 15 Zoom lectures for the congregation. Right? That couldn't have happened. What that will ultimately mean, we have yet to see. Will it actually change Judaism? I don't know. But it's going to be kind of fun to watch over the next years.
Absolutely. Well, once again, Harry, thank you so much for a very enlightening session. And we wish you Nasiya Tova as you go to Antarctica. You'll have to come back and report on your trip and whether or not there was any synagogue that you found.
Well, actually, I did notice that Chabad has a very strong presence there.
I'm sure.
Because,
are you serious?
Yeah, if you look at all the penguins, they're already dressed like that.
Right. Right. Anyway, I look forward to hearing about the trip, and we're so glad to have had you again here tonight.
Thanks.
So,
and see you all around sometime, I hope.
Absolutely.
Maybe one day in person.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Yes. Take care, everyone.
Okay, see you next month.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Sure.